The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I know the exact time because I was in the middle of signing a parts order, and I set my pen down on the counter when I saw her name on the screen. After 31 years, you'd think a phone call from your wife wouldn't make you pause, but something in my chest already knew. I answered. She didn't say hello. "I need you to come home," she said, "and I need you to bring a bag." I asked her what she meant by that. She said, "I think you know." I didn't know. Or maybe I did, I just wasn't ready to admit it out loud yet. I told my assistant I had a family matter and I left the shop. The drive home takes 14 minutes on a normal day. That day I hit every light green, and it still felt like the longest drive of my life. My wife and I had been married since I was 32 years old. We built everything together, the house, the business, the life. I ran a small auto repair shop in the same town where I was born. Nothing fancy, but it was mine. Ours. We raised 2 kids in that house, sent them both to college, watched them move away and start their own lives. And when the kids were gone and it was just the 2 of us again, I thought, this is fine. This is how it's supposed to go. I wasn't wrong exactly. I was just incomplete. My wife had a sister 8 years older than her. They weren't close, not in the way people picture sisters being close. They spoke on birthdays, holidays, sometimes not even then. Her sister had married well the first time and better the second time, and she'd moved to Scottsdale and lived a life that looked nothing like ours. Big house, no kids, a financial advisor husband who died of a heart attack 3 years ago and left her with more money than most people see in 5 lifetimes. I never resented any of that. I had what I needed. What I didn't know, what my wife had apparently known for almost 6 months, was that her sister had been sick. Stage 4, pancreatic. And in those last months, she'd made some decisions about her estate that nobody told me about, including my wife. My wife knew she was getting something. She didn't know how much. I found out the same day she did, in the sense that she told me the day she found out. But she'd had about 4 hours to sit with the information before I walked through that door. 4 hours is a long time. You can do a lot of thinking in 4 hours. You can make decisions you couldn't have made at hour 1. When I came in, she was sitting at the kitchen table. Not the couch, not the bedroom. The kitchen table, which is where we always had our serious conversations. Taxes, the kids' school problems, the year the shop almost went under. That table had seen a lot. She had a folder in front of her. I sat down across from her. I didn't pour coffee. I just sat. She pushed the folder toward me and said, "Her estate settled this morning." I opened it. I won't say the number out loud here, because even now it feels like it belongs to a different story, not mine. But it was substantial. More than my shop was worth. More than our house was worth. More than our house was worth. More than I'd earned in 31 years of working 6 days a week. I looked up at her. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying. She had this expression I'd seen maybe twice before in our marriage. The one that meant she'd already made up her mind about something and was now simply informing me. "I've been thinking," she said, "that this changes things." I asked her, "What things?" She said, "Us." I set the folder down, slowly. I didn't rush that moment. I took a breath and I said, "Explain that to me." And she did. 45 minutes. She explained that she'd felt suffocated for years, that she'd stayed because of the kids, and then stayed because it was easier than leaving. And now she had options she'd never had before, and she wasn't going to pretend anymore. She said she'd already spoken to someone, an attorney. She said she wanted me out of the house by the end of the week so she could begin the process cleanly. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt once. When she finished, I asked her one question. I said, "Is there someone else?" She looked at me for a long time, and then she said no. I believed her, and I still believe her. This wasn't about another man. This was about a woman who'd been given a door she'd never had before, and she walked through it. I can understand that, even if I can't make peace with how she did it. I went upstairs and I packed 2 bags, not because I agreed with her, but because I needed to think, and I couldn't think in that house. I took my shaving kit, my work clothes, some books, and the small wooden box my father gave me when I turned 18. I left everything else exactly where it was. I drove to a motel on the highway outside of town. The kind with a vending machine in the parking lot and a heating unit that rattles all night. I sat on the edge of the bed and I stared at the carpet. And I tried to feel something definable. Anger, maybe. Or grief. What I felt instead was a kind of stillness, like the moment right after a car accident, before the pain arrives. I didn't call my daughter that night. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there and thought about the house. Not my wife in it. The house itself. The front porch I rebuilt twice. The garage where I taught my son to change a tire. The kitchen table. I thought, that table is in my name too. Here's what my wife didn't know, because I'd never thought to mention it in the normal course of a marriage. 3 years into our marriage, when we bought the house, I'd insisted on something my own father had drilled into me. He'd been through a bad divorce before he met my mother, and he'd lost property he'd built with his own hands. He used to say, never put your name on something you're not willing to fight for, and never let your name come off something you built. The house was in both our names. That part she knew. What she didn't know was the agreement I'd had drawn up the same year we bought it, a co-ownership agreement that predated the formal mortgage by 11 days, drafted by a property attorney my father had used, which specified that neither party could compel the other to vacate a jointly held primary residence without a court order and a formal partition proceeding. It wasn't a prenup. It was something older and quieter than that. I hadn't thought about that document in 20 years. It was in a fireproof box in the back of my workshop, underneath my father's old socket set. I thought about it that night at the motel. The next morning, I made 2 calls before 7 o'clock. The first was to a property attorney in the county seat, a man my accountant had recommended years ago. I told him the situation in plain terms. He asked me some questions. I answered them. He said, "Come in at 10. The second call was to my shop. I told my assistant I'd be late and to open without me. I drove to the attorney's office with my father's fireproof box on the passenger seat. I signed in at the front desk, and I sat in a chair with my hands folded, and I waited. His name was Hutchins, young, maybe 40, clean desk, no clutter. He read the co-ownership agreement twice without speaking. Then he sat back and looked at me over the top of his glasses. He said, "Where did you have this drafted?" I told him. He said, "And your wife is aware of this document?" I said, "I don't believe she's thought about it in a long time." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "You understand that this doesn't prevent a divorce. She can still file." I said I understood that. He said, "What it does prevent is unilateral removal. She cannot ask you to leave the primary residence without a court proceeding, and given that the house predates any inheritance she's received, the inheritance itself has no bearing on joint property unless it was formally commingled." I said, "She hasn't moved any money yet." He said, "Then we should have a conversation about how you'd like to proceed." I told him I wasn't interested in taking anything from her. I wasn't interested in her inheritance. I wasn't going to contest the divorce if she truly wanted one. That was her right, and I believed in letting people make their choices. What I was interested in was not being removed from my home in the same week I'd been informed my marriage was over. What I was interested in was a fair proceeding, not a fast one designed around her new financial position. Hutchins wrote something on his legal pad. He said, "That's a very reasonable position." She called me Thursday afternoon. I was back at the shop by then because work is the only thing I know to do with my hands when everything else stops making sense. Her voice was different. The certainty was still there, but it had something underneath it now, something that sounded like she'd spoken to her own attorney and learned something she hadn't expected. She said, "We need to talk about the house." I said, "I agree." She said, "I've been advised that there may be some complications." I said, "I've been advised the same." A pause, long enough that I could hear the shop compressor cycling in the background. She said, "Did you plan this?" I said, "No, I planned a marriage." Another pause. She said, "Where are you staying?" I told her the motel on Route 9. She said, "You don't have to stay there." I said, "I'll stay where I'm comfortable until this is sorted out." She said, "Okay." Then she said, "I'm not trying to hurt you." I said I knew that, and I meant it. Whatever my wife was, she wasn't cruel. She was someone who'd been handed a different life than the one she had, and she wanted to live it. That's not the same as cruelty. It just has some of the same side effects. What followed was not dramatic. It didn't happen in a single day, and there was no single moment where I stood across a room and delivered some speech that changed everything. That's not how real life works, and anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or selling something. What happened was a process, a slow, deliberate process that took 11 weeks, from the first conversation to the signed separation agreement. We agreed on a division of the jointly held property. The house went to her, because I didn't want to live in it alone, and I didn't want to fight over it, but I was compensated fairly, not because she suddenly became generous, but because the co-ownership agreement made anything less than fair compensation a legal problem she couldn't afford. Hutchins negotiated that part. I sat in his office twice a week and read the paperwork he handed me and asked questions until I understood every line. The shop was mine, clear and undisputed. I'd owned the building outright for 9 years, financed through the business, titled in my name alone. That was never in question. My retirement accounts were divided according to the standard formula under state law. No surprises there. Her inheritance, the full amount from her sister's estate, remained hers entirely. I never asked for a cent of it. Not during negotiations, not after. It was her sister's money. It had nothing to do with the life we built together. And I wasn't going to be the man who reached for something that wasn't his, just because the law might have given me an argument. I signed the separation agreement on a Wednesday morning in Hutchins' conference room. My wife was across the table with her own attorney. We didn't speak directly during the meeting. We nodded at each other when it was done. In the parking lot, we were alone for a minute while her attorneys dealt with the copies. She said, "I hope you know I didn't expect it to go this way." I said, "What way did you expect it to go?" She said, "Easier." I said, "For who?" She looked at me. And for the first time since the kitchen table, I saw something that looked like regret. Not regret about leaving, I don't think she regretted that. But regret about the how of it. The bag she'd asked me to pack. The tone she'd used. The 4 hours she'd had alone with that information before I came home. I said, "It's okay." And I meant that too. I moved into a rental house on the east side of town 6 weeks after the motel. 2 bedrooms, a garage, a yard with a live oak that drops leaves from October through February. The landlord was an older man named, well, he reminded me of my father. That's enough. I kept the shop. I kept my tools. I kept my father's wooden box and his socket set and the fireproof box that had turned out to matter more than I'd expected. My daughter called me the first Sunday after I moved in. She'd heard from her mother, and then she'd heard my version, and she sat on the phone with me for an hour and a half without once asking me to be reasonable or look at it from both sides. She just listened, and at the end she said, "Dad, are you okay?" I said, "I think I will be." She said, "That's good enough for now." My son called the following week. His conversation was shorter. He's always been a man of fewer words, even as a boy. He said, "You need anything?" I said, "No." He said, "You sure?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Okay, I'm here." And that was that. People ask me sometimes, not many people, but some, whether I'm angry. I've thought about that question more than I expected to. Here's what I've landed on. I'm not angry at my wife. I'm not angry at her sister's estate, or the money, or the timing. I'm not angry at the attorney who drew up my co-ownership agreement 30 years ago, even though he's the reason things didn't go exactly the way my wife had planned. What I am is tired, and honest, and quieter than I used to be. I spent 31 years believing I was building something with someone. And maybe I was. Maybe what I built just wasn't the same thing she thought she was building. 2 people can construct the same wall and imagine entirely different rooms on the other side. That's not a crime. That's just a marriage. The shop turns 63 next spring. I mean the building. It was a gas station before I converted it. I've been in that space for 29 years. I know which floorboard creaks. I know that the bay door on the left sticks when the temperature drops below 40. I know where the light falls at 4 in the afternoon and how the whole place smells on a cold morning before the heaters kick on. That's what I have left, and it turns out to be more than enough. I close up most evenings around 6. I drive home along the same road I've driven for years. The live oak in the yard has started to feel familiar, the way all things do when you stop treating them as temporary. I make dinner. I read. Sometimes I sit on the back step with a glass of iced tea, and I listen to the neighborhood settle into night. There is one thing I'll tell you, and I'll say it plainly because I've earned the right to be plain. When my wife made her decision, she made it in 4 hours, in a kitchen, with a folder in front of her. She made it based on what she could see. The money. The options. The door that had opened up in front of her. She didn't think to look behind her, to ask what was already built, what was already documented in a fireproof box under a socket set, in a workshop that smelled like motor oil and cold concrete. I'm not saying she was wrong to go. I'm saying she was wrong about what she was taking with her. The quietest thing I ever did was not argue that day, not raise my voice, not demand an explanation, not beg her to reconsider. I drove to a motel. I sat on the edge of a bed, and I let time do what it does. It told the story just fine on its own. I keep coming back to that folder on the kitchen table, the way she pushed it toward me like it settled something. Like a number on a page could redraw 31 years. What I've come to understand, not right away but slowly, the way most true things arrive, is that what happened to me wasn't just about money or property or a co-ownership agreement sitting in a fireproof box. It was about the kind of man I'd been deciding to be, quietly, for decades without ever naming it out loud. My father used to say that a man's character is what he does when nobody's watching and nothing's at stake. I think he was close, but not quite right. I think character is what you've already done by the time everything is at stake. Because when the moment comes, and it always comes, you don't build character on the spot. You just find out what's already there. I didn't argue with my wife that afternoon, not because I was resigned and not because I was weak. I was quiet because I already knew what I built. I knew what was in that box. I knew what Hutchins would say when he read the agreement, and I knew that the worst thing I could do, for her, for myself, for whatever was left of the people we'd been to each other, was to turn that kitchen into a courtroom. That's the thing nobody tells you about integrity. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It just holds its shape under pressure the way good metal does, the way a well-built house does when the weather turns. And then there's the matter of being prepared. Not paranoid, prepared. My father's advice about that co-ownership agreement wasn't cynicism. It was wisdom dressed in plain clothes. He'd been through a loss he hadn't seen coming, and he made sure I understood enough to protect what I built. I listened. I filed the paperwork. I forgot about it for 20 years, the way you forget about a spare key, until you need it. That's what foresight costs, almost nothing most of the time. And what it returns when the day comes is everything. But the part that stayed with me longest wasn't the legal victory, if you want to call it that. It was my daughter's voice on the phone that first Sunday. She didn't try to fix it or mediate or offer me a perspective I hadn't asked for. She just listened, and when she finally spoke, she said, "That's good enough for now." 6 words. I've thought about them more than I've thought about the separation agreement. Getting through something hard doesn't require grand gestures or perfectly timed speeches. It requires getting up the next morning, driving to work, answering the phone when your daughter calls, choosing, over and over, not to become bitter about what you lost. Not because bitterness isn't understandable, but because it would cost you things you still have. I still close the shop around 6. I still drive home the same way. The live oak in the yard drops leaves all winter, and I rake them on Saturday mornings. It's a small life measured from the outside. But it's mine, and I know every corner of it, and I built it with my own hands. That counts for something. It has to.